either on the Rev School website that will be debuting after this, or just through our social media platforms, Rebel Media Group and all the Revolution School pages. So up next, we are going to have a co-hosted panel with Colin Basil talking about the state, the police, and the history of Black Southern communists. So if you guys are ready, you can go ahead and hop on. There we go.
Hey everybody, I'm going to introduce myself and then I'm going to introduce Cole and Basil, who will be doing the presenting. I'm just going to kind of act as a facilitator, and so if you have questions, you can either submit them to the Q&A on the bottom, or you can just drop them in the chat like we were doing. But my name is Jeremiah, and I'll do a more lengthy introduction, but I'm a member of the Party for Socialism and Liberation, as are Basil and Cole. And so I'm excited. We've got some questions that are going to try to see the synergy between Lenin's text, State and Revolution, and some of the theory there around communist revolution and the actual organizing that took place on the ground in the 1930s and 40s in the South among Black Southern communists. So I want to first introduce Basil Jupiter. Basil, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, my name is Basil Jupiter. As Jeremiah mentioned earlier, I'm a member of the Party for Socialism and Liberation. I'm also a member of the United Campus Workers, which is a campus union. We have presence in like all schools, all public universities in Mississippi. I'm a resident of Madison, Mississippi. Almost lifetime resident of Mississippi, been all over Mississippi. Love Mississippi. Cole, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, my name is Cole. They didn't pronounce, for those that don't know. I'm also, like they said, I'm also a member of the Party for Socialism and Liberation here in Memphis. I've been in the party for almost a year now. And I'm really excited to talk about this topic with y'all, particularly State and Revolution. It's in fact the book that, truly still, I think, solidified my ideology as a communist ideology, as a Marxist ideology, and laid the foundation for my politics and the way that I view the necessity of dismantling capitalism and building socialism in the United States.
Dope. So I think as revolutionaries, as materialists, I think it's important to kind of ground in the history and the specific context of the different things that we're talking about. So if we could just do a little bit of that. Basil, could you speak first? What was organizing like in Alabama and in the South during the Great Depression? And what was kind of the material context for some of this organizing?
Yeah, so to really get into, I guess, like how organizing was like in that specific period of, around, the Great Depression. First, we have to think about Reconstruction and like the Civil War, Reconstruction, and like the period in between, 1865 and 1929. So first of all, specifically focusing on Birmingham, Alabama, it was honestly very different from like what people think about when they think of like a southern town in the 1930s. It was often called the Philadelphia of the South, and that was very much like an urban city with high number of immigrants, a huge industrial center, and this is because there's like a lot of mineral deposits, specifically coal. So, you had like a lot of immigrants coming in. You had like a lot of people who used to be, who used to just, work in agriculture, coming into these factories and coming into these mines. So even like, even before the arrival of communist organizers in 1929, there was organizing going on, like militant labor organizing going on. It was integrated, and like more often than not, it was Black led. So like like kind of like starts out with like one of the organizations was the National Union of Alabama, which was, you know, like a black-led union, and yeah, attempted to organize agricultural workers, industrial workers throughout the state of Alabama. And then you had the Knights of Labor, which was nationally, like, I think, I'm pretty sure it was the first interracial like union, and also organized throughout Alabama, and even had like workers' assemblies in, you know, places like Jefferson County. They had strikes in 1882 and 1885, but there was like a decline after 1885 due to the kind of anti-labor hysteria after the Haymarket riots in Chicago. But after the Knights of Labor, a lot of those organizers in Alabama then went on to form the United Mine Workers, or the UMW. And, you know, they were organizing in the mines, but were pretty much crushed in 1894 after this huge miner strike. But they had and this is like the level of intensity of organizing in Alabama at the time. They had 603 strikes between 1881 and 1905. So, well, 1936. So that's a high, you know, very high density of labor action in Alabama. But what really kind of weakened it was, you know, unions, the employers in the mines, you know, would use, you know, tactics of, you know, splitting up the working class by, you know, appealing to racism, you know, and also like appealing to racism to break up, you know, these multiracial unions. Also, a lot of it was just brute force, you know, like the 1894 miners' strike was broken up by the state National Guard. And, you know, like it was, you know, they were very, you know, forceful, and like, you know, it's like breaking up any type of labor activity. So, you know, so like in 1919, 1920, like when, you know, when these like strikes were broken up by, you know, like the army, it kind of like was a death knell for biracial unionism in Alabama. So the kind of after this period, the unions got a lot more conservative, a lot more, you know, only organized skilled workers, which were, you know, like, and really only focused on like white workers. So like, you know, unions like the Metal Trade Council of Birmingham, but yeah, like they were ignoring black workers, which were the majority of the workforce. So 1920, you know, kind of circling back to, you know, the original question, you know, like how organizing was like for the Communist Party. You know, 1929 comes around, and, you know, it's a great, you know, start of the Great Depression. Really, I mean, Alabama, you know, goes back to, you know, old saying, like, you know, when white America has, you know, cold, like Black America, you know, has a way worse. So, you know, I really, you know, and like especially in the South. So really, Alabama was feeling the effects of the Great Depression around 1927. You know, and all the things that come with it. You know, like mass evictions, people losing their jobs, you know, like people getting less pay. And that's not just, and we're not just talking about like people who are like mine workers, you know, like traditional type of, you know, worker, you know, mine workers and things like that. But we're also talking about like sharecroppers. We're talking about people who work in like who like work in, you know, people's homes, domestic workers, you know, getting less pay or getting laid off. So there was a lot of like, you know, when you know, like organizers, you know, from the Communist Party, you know, like came around like in 1929, all the organizers Most of them were, white people from like New York and other like northern cities where the Communist Party already had like a stronghold. But when they come around, they had an open meeting in Alabama, with like hundreds of people in attendance. And then like a week later, one of the organizers' houses is firebombed because, obviously things are a lot different in the South, where there was like a lot of initial interest in the Communist Party from mainly like Black people in all these industries I just mentioned, and because like times are just like so tough, but also because like that, even though most majority people in the South, and like the people that they're recruiting like had like really had no idea of like what left politics were, or like any any of these concepts, and never came across like Lenin or Marx or anything like that, but they still were interested in the party because they kind of saw the party as continuing the work that was that was unfinished, like during the Civil War, after the Civil War, during Reconstruction, and also like in that period in between where you saw this high level of labor organizing that was basically destroyed after 1920s. So during this time, there was like a great level, you saw this great level of grassroots organizing. It shifted from kind of just being really quickly shifted from just being white communists from the north. What they envisioned at first was that they would be just like organizing kind of like rebellious white kids, like the sons of like people who were like more conservative than them, and they they would be the one like leading the battle in the South. That did not happen. Most white people did not in the South didn't in like Birmingham did not really want to have anything to do with the Communist Party, because to be like associated with the Communist Party would mean basically social ostracization. So I mean, a lot of the white people that did join were already like ostracized, or didn't mind risking ostracized, or like did it very much in secret. But it was still like a very small amount, and the biggest amount of like rank and file membership and leadership came from the Black working class and sharecroppers and homemakers and things like that. So a lot of the issues they organized around were like a lot of issues we're organizing around today, like we're organizing around home, like unemployment and people getting kicked out of their homes. They did the same thing. What they would do is they would form unemployment councils made up of people unemployed, and they would advocate for different reforms, and have like marches, and also like a lot of really like covert things, like they like they organize around like people's immediate needs, such as like often they would have to convince like landlords to not like evict people from their homes. Like a lot of times it would just be like the representative from the unemployed council would talk to them, or sometimes they use like means like how we do phone zapping today. Back in the day, when a lot of people didn't have phones, what they would do instead is they just like flood the landlord's office with postcards and letters. So that's kind of a back in the day thing. And also they would, if the water was shut off, or if the electricity was shut off, I mean, Communist Party members would literally come in if the electricity was shut off, they literally come in with some like, jumper cables and like hook like, it up to like a public source, or they will hook it up to a, someone else's house. So, they can get electricity, or, they hook up the water main to like if they shut off the water, they hook that up and, they get water. So, like they found all these ways to get around the system to meet people's immediate needs, while also advocating for these real structural reforms. And they're also advocating for, integration in the South. And, this is way before, like any like formal type of, what we think about as, the civil rights movement today. So yeah, another big aspect of and why the Communist Party was so popular among poor Black people in Alabama was the International Labor Defense, or the ILD, which is what like this association they set up in like to defend any working class person that was in legal trouble, for being a working class person. So one of the people one of the big cases the ILD was involved in were the Scottsboro Boys, which were these people in Alabama, Black men in Alabama, that were accused of raping white women while on the train while catching a boxcar. And a lot, there was a, what the Communist Party was doing with the International Labor Defense and defending them was they were filling a void that a lot of the more elite middle class groups like the NAACP would not touch with a 10-foot pole. Like they were not touching the Scottsboro Boys, but the International Labor Defense was, because they're defending any working class person, and especially in the South, working class people are under the most attack, Black working class people, and middle class and bourgeois Black organizations weren't touching those issues, and a lot of a lot of labor unions were not appealing to the Black working class. They were completely ignoring them. So the Communist Party with International Labor Defense really got popular after defending the Scottsboro Boys. So yeah, like those are kind of like the aspects. They were doing union organizing of like tenant farmers, and mine workers, industrial workers. They were doing the unemployed councils, and creating that leadership, and they were also doing that legal defense work, and they're also doing that mutual aid with the meeting people's immediate needs, as far as like old jumper cables and things like that. Yeah.
Comrade, that's super helpful context. And what I think is like really interesting about it is the fact that like, and I think this is a product of like American hegemony in the way that we learn history, that we think of that history as isolated, but actually like at the same time, we're seeing revolution in Russia. So Cole, could you give us some of that context of like what's going on in Russia as we're seeing this kind of organizing starting to happen in the South? Can you just give us some of the context for the Russian Revolution?
Yeah, and so I do want to preface this with, my education on the Russian Revolution is still very much an ongoing thing, but I do have a very solid sort of general overview. But I think one important thing to understand is, Russia was at this time under a czarist autocracy and in the midst of an imperialist world war. The masses of people in Russia, Russia was 75% peasants. Worn out of this war, there was mass suffering because of this war, and the other thing that's the other piece of context that's really important is there were two revolutions in Russia. There was the February Revolution and the October Revolution. The February Revolution being more of a kind of spontaneous revolution that was actually sparked by a very large women's protest in Russia, and that sort of led to the ousting of the czar. That the czar was overthrown in the February Revolution, and sort of the bourgeois elite was able to take power during that revolution, and other socialist parties outside of the Bolsheviks sort of were able to kind of take power or throw their lot in with this revolution. The Mensheviks, the socialist revolutionaries. The Bolsheviks at this time were a very small party, but they threw their lot in with the peasants, and that's sort of how they were able to achieve the level of success that the Bolsheviks ultimately attained. But at the time of the February Revolution, I mean, there was mass excitement about this. There was hope that would be the end of the war. It wasn't. That was a part of the reason that the Second Revolution happened. But so it's important to understand that this first revolution was essentially, in a lot of ways, a bourgeois revolution. It didn't take power away from the capitalists and put it into the hands of the workers. It wasn't a workers' revolution. It was spontaneous, just people being fed up with like the czarist regime and wanting to oust them. So there wasn't a clear like, and now we're going to have this kind of government situation. And it was even most of the Bolsheviks were really sort of content with that. They were content with like, oh well, let's just like try to be influence this new government and try to see how we can struggle with that. It was really Lenin himself that understood that there had to be a second revolution that took power away the capitalist and crushed the capitalist state and began to replace it with a proletarian state. And the important thing there is that Lenin also understood that this couldn't take place. It couldn't just be like a Bolshevik coup or anything like that. And I mean, it's often misportrayed as a Bolshevik coup, but like Lenin understood and told the Bolsheviks that we have to go out and convince the people, because the people right now, they're content with this government. And that's when they threw their lot in with the peasants and began struggling with them and began going out and talking to the people and helping them see that like this isn't what's going to bring us liberation. This isn't what is going to bring the end of the war. The war continued after this first revolution. And so the suffering of that war continued. And Lenin understood this ahead of time that would continue, and that that the Bolsheviks needed to go out and show the people that like this isn't what is going to emancipate us. This is we need a second revolution, a true workers' revolution. And I mean, that's what it was. The Russian Revolution was the first time that workers and peasants took control of their government.
That's really helpful context. And in particular, like one thing that I want to highlight already that I'm seeing across both struggles is this importance of like the people and the masses and specifically peasants. And I say peasants not in any derogatory way, but what I more mean is like rural people who are displaced, dispossessed. Like Basil, you'd mentioned sharecroppers. Cole, you had mentioned the peasants, and then uniting their struggle with workers and proletariat, what we can traditionally consider to be proletariat, which are like urban wage workers. So I'm curious, actually, Basil, I want to ask, how did that synergy of struggle play out in the South? The synergy between urban proletarian workers and rural peasant sharecroppers. Was there explicit cooperation between those two groups? Were they sort of united under the communist banner? Like, do you see any kind of similarity there in the unity of workers in the urban and rural?
And yeah, I mean, yeah, they organized, all types of workers. So yeah, there was, inherently there was synergy between, urban workers, in the, mines and in the factories, and also, like the rural workers who are, working, on the, as tenant farmers, as sharecroppers. And you saw like several strikes on both ends while the Communist Party was organizing there, between with both like urban and on the rural side.
And Cole, do you like Lenin writes a lot about the Vanguard Party? What is, can you break that down a little bit, what the Vanguard Party is, and then maybe talk about us, were there similar dynamics of you mentioned peasants and workers sort of uniting under the Vanguard Party. Can you just talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So I mean, yeah, what I was saying earlier about like Lenin understanding that like the Bolsheviks had to go out and educate the people as to why a second revolution was necessary to achieve emancipation. I mean, that's ultimately the goal of the Vanguard Party. Is it's the most class conscious group of workers and exploited people, whose role in the revolution is to like educate and lead the rest of the masses in a revolutionary direction. And that's not from a position of I don't know exactly the word is, but it's connected to the people. It's an essential part of that kind of vanguard leadership is to what the Bolsheviks did: go out among the people, talk to them about their needs, and then sort of bring them back to the Mao, sort of to go into that, sort of elaborated and really kind of perfected that idea, I think, with his idea of like the mass line. Go out into people, talk to them about their needs, bring it to the Central Committee of the Vanguard Party, discuss like how can we meet these needs. And that's really what I see as like the largest goal of the Vanguard Party, is to both educate the masses of people and to throw their lot in and struggle with them, like, and not be detached from them, not say well, this struggle is going on, that but it's not, or it doesn't have a revolutionary consciousness, so we're not going to be a part of it. The job of the Vanguard Party is to be a part of that and to bring into it a revolutionary consciousness.
And this is kind of exactly how this is exactly how the Communist Party in Birmingham was organizing. Was it was at first they thought that most class conscious part would be white workers when they came over. And what they realized was that even though most of the workers in Birmingham did not like know about Marx or Lenin or any of that, there was also like a higher rate of illiteracy, so there's also that huge learning curve. They actually took on really quick and were able to like really like adapt to those conditions. So like on the front of like educating the workers, oftentimes they had regular study groups during meetings. So it'd be 1 hour of reading, 1 hour like of just like independent study, 1 hour of reading aloud, and then like not 1 hour, 15 minutes of reading aloud. And so that kind of like was a way like a lot of people like learn these texts. So they read Marx, Lenin of course, and they'd also read works of like American communists, like James Allen's Negro Liberation. They also make their own basically literature, like poems, like talking about workers' revolution in the South, and also like talking about and like connecting that with Lenin. So I mean, what they're doing was they were connecting like their struggles as like Black workers in the South with the with the concepts of like Marxism, Leninism, of like of of what Lenin was talking about, and even like going as so far as we talk about the black belt theory, which was that Black people in the United States specifically, at the time, talking about the South, were an oppressed nationality, that should form their own nation. Now, first, this did not really catch on with Black workers, so they're mainly like focusing on integration. And when a lot of people talk about this kind of they kind of think it's like an either or thing, like integration and the concept of a Black nation. But I think like when you think about this period in the context of the larger Black liberation movement, is kind of like more so like a both and question rather than an either or question, because there were a lot of Black people who like it's there's a desire for both like Black nationhood and also like but also like getting like more immediate rights as long as the system exists. Yeah, like speaking to the like question of like how like kind of like how is similar to the Vanguard Party. I mean, it really was the first time that there was like, well, not the first time, because like beforehand it was like the unions, but it was the first time like in the really like even beyond unionism, in the really like political sense and really like community sense, there was like working class Black leadership in the South, because the leadership was all Black in the party. So you had these like people who beforehand did not know anything about communism, Marx and Lenin. Like one of the famous quotes from Alabama communists was none of us were born communists, we became communists. And so had these people educated in Marxism, Leninism, who were doing these actions like unemployment councils and all these things. And yeah, so they were like they were making these real changes, and they're educating themselves, and they were connected to the struggles of the people, because they were the people. They were the most oppressed like section of the working class, and for the first time they're really like fighting for themselves. Yeah.
Yeah, and so I want to ask about that role of education. In particular, this is a question we got in our chat, which is, do you think that the process of educating the masses has become more difficult in the age of information? In particular, like Cole, you had mentioned, Lenin's writing State and Revolution as a way of educating the party. And then, Basil, you'd mentioned these study groups and these reading sessions. But we live in this age of like hyper reality, and this age of like mass information available online, and mass misinformation available online. So I guess the question is sort of rooted in this, like, what lessons can we learn from the modes of education that were pursued by these vanguard parties in the past? And how do you see today's landscape as different in positive or negative ways? And let me start with Cole, speaking specifically about the Bolsheviks, and then Basil, I'd like you to speak about that too, in the American context.
Well, yeah, and to the point, like Lenin writing State and Revolution as a way of educating, I mentioned the two revolutions. Lenin wrote State and Revolution in between those revolutions to sort of elucidate to the people that like why a second revolution was necessary, why you couldn't simply seize the bourgeois state machine and use it to accomplish the goals of the proletariat, of working people and oppressed people. You needed a new state that was designed to meet the needs of oppressed people. But yeah, to the question, like the role of education now, one book that I've been reading lately is Blood in My Eye by George Jackson, which I can't recommend enough. It's one of probably the most important things that I feel like I've read since State and Revolution. But he talks about, you know, at one point, you know, and remember this book was written in 1970, 1971, far before the age of information became as advanced as it is. But he understood even then that, you know, the way that the bourgeois information machine worked was it teaches people it teaches people what to think. That's sort of what we grow up, the environment that we grow up in and being conditioned under is, you know, not how to think, but what to think and see. And so, but he explains that the Vanguard Party has the much more difficult job of not teaching people what to think, but how to think, how to analyze, you know, what we're receiving in the media, you know, like where are these sources coming from, who benefits from this. And I think you can see that in how, you know, a lot of anti-communist propaganda takes place against, you know, countries like Venezuela, Cuba, China, the DPRK, where we're, you know, inundated with all of this, you know, anti-China, especially anti-China rhetoric. We're kind of in a new Cold War with China and a new Red Scare. And so a lot of this information, you know, we're seeing, you know, articles about, you know, China's doing this, China's doing that. But, you know, where are these sources coming from? Who's putting this information out, you know? And that's sort of the dichotomy there, is, you know, the bourgeois state machine is like saying, here's what to think about China. Whereas, you know, what the PSL, for example, is trying to do is saying like, well, you know, like take a step back, like look at like where this information is coming from, like what's really going on here. How do we really know that this is what's happening in the DPRK? How do we really know that this is what's happening in China? And so as far as like tactics of, you know, confronting that sort of anti-intellectualism, I mean, I think, you know, a big part of it is, you know, like, you know, what I talked about with like Lenin and the Bolsheviks earlier, throwing their lot in with the peasants, is, you know, we have to throw our lot in with the most oppressed class, with the people for any kind of progressive struggle, whether we consider it, you know, that particular movement or that particular action, you know, as revolutionary as we think it needs to be. You know, we need where the people are struggling with them, showing their concerns are
Comrade, you're a little choppy on us, but I want to, just to protect the time, I'm going to pivot to Basil, and then hopefully when you get caught up, you can finish that thought. So save that thought. Basil, can you speak on...
we build trust. That's how, you know,
So Basil, can you speak on the connections that you see to like how the communists were organizing in the South and today, and maybe even tagging in somewhat to what Cole was just saying about encouraging people about how to think instead of what to think, those sorts of ideas?
Yeah, I mean, you know, what the Communist Party did in, you know, the South was, you know, they really connect, you know, I was talking about, you know, like all the poetry and, you know, songs that were, you know, were being made, you know, that were being chanted, you know, like, you know, what we got to do, you know, as like communist revolutionaries now is, you know, we really got to copy, you know, that model of like connecting, you know, like our internationalism, our working class internationalism, with, you know, like the already existing cultures of, you know, resistance, you know, art and things like that of the people. And also, you know, being extremely patient educating the people. if Communist Party back then could educate people on Marx and Lenin, who did not even know how to read, we can do that. We can do that now. We can, we should really, shift our focus as revolutionaries from, let's just, touch on the people who are already educated on this stuff, to, sit down and focus to, okay, let's, do this in a way that is, accessible to everybody as possible. And I think we overhype, how, I guess, how effective, in, the, media disinformation is, because because of Donald Trump and a lot of, rise of, far right media and things like that, we've overhyped, we think fake news is a new thing, but in organizing, even in the 30s, fake news had a real, I guess, was a real factor in dissuading, white people from joining the party. For example, they would say, they really it seemed like they would really assassinate the characters of, the, white communist organizers a lot, because they would be oh, this, white communist organizer, he's not even really white. He's half Jew, half Chinese. They literally say stuff like this to Southern newspapers at the time. It's really ridiculous stuff about communist organizers. It's the same stuff they say about Antifa. These communists are going to come into your town and they're going to start a race riot. They're going to enforce biracial marriages and things like that. Just the word equality was in the South, the word something we think so basic, the word equality was associated just with chaos and to southern southern lights. Social equality was literally a bad word. When communists were marching, people would ask them, "Oh, you're for social equality, aren't you?" So, there's always, especially in the United States Imperial Core, there's always been a huge amount of propaganda. And as communists, we should do what we've always been doing, because, it's always, worked, is, we should be having, stuff like this, regular, sessions for educating the people, and we do it in a way that people can really understand and grasp onto, that people really relate to, that people can connect to their situations at the present time. We talk about how they organize for, when I was talking about unemployment councils and how they're organizing around rent and evictions. There are a lot of people who are unemployed now, a lot of people under threat of eviction. Hopefully this can give you some ideas.
That's great. That's super helpful. And I think that this sort of highlights a through line, which is that we're grounded in materialism and we're grounded in the needs of people. And so it's not an abstract idea that you convince somebody discursively through you do, but you're just giving them a different explanatory framework for the need that they already feel and the condition that they already experience. And I think that ties back to Christina's presentation really nicely. So thank you so much for that question, Des. And in the Q&A, we've got a question from Aaron that I don't think we actually have time for. I think we've got to hop off. So, but Basil and Cole, if y'all get a chance, that I think that's a great question to answer. It's about how can we counter some of this Western anti. Oh yeah.
Yeah, no, y'all got time, Jeremiah. You can address that question.
Oh, word. Okay, great. So Aaron writes, what do y'all think is the best way to begin debunking the Western propaganda a lot of people believe about China, the DPRK, and other communist regimes? Oftentimes, people are very ideologically opposed to the idea that these states are not as oppressive as we've been led to believe.
Yeah, no, that's a really, really good question. And I mean, just the other day, I saw a friend of mine share something on Facebook that he was sort of like equating the Trump administration with the DPRK, and I shared with them this documentary called Loyal Citizens of Pyongyang that analyzes. It's what I was talking about earlier with what to think versus how to think. There's stories from these like DPRK defectors, but this like documentary is analyzing like what are these people's like motives, like who's funding these people, like what goal is this information like ultimately like serving. But so anyway, they were very resistant to even watching the link that I had sent them, and their response was like, I'm not even going to and this is a pretty good friend of mine. It's not just some like rando on the internet. It's a pretty good friend of mine who I have a trusting, solid relationship with, and they were like, I love you, but I'm not even going to consider that the DPRK isn't cruel to its people. And that in the face of a very well sourced, very well made documentary, they're just like, I'm not going to watch it, I'm not going to consider it. So we had this short little debate that wasn't even about is the DPRK good, is the DPRK bad, but was simply about like getting him to say like, okay, like I might watch this. And so yeah, it's a difficult question. I think a big thing is to come ready with sources, to be to educate ourselves first, to be prepared to answer these questions from people, and I think another important thing too is we have to answer. Huey P talks about there's a great quote from him about even people with bourgeois attitudes we have to respond to in a polite way, because like we're not going to convince and that's I think speaking of like the age of information and social media, there's a tendency to snap back to comments like that with like these like short little like quips, snarky responses. But I think it's very important that we be patient with people and meet people with like where they're at and understand like the propaganda that people have been inundated with their whole life is very difficult to shake hold of. Certainly myself in my own education, I didn't read the Communist Manifesto and State and Revolution and become a communist and instantly decide that like everything about the DPRK is lie, that we hear in the West is a lie. I was skeptical of it, for sure. It definitely made me more skeptical of it, but I still bought into certain ideas about the DPRK that are fed to us in the West, because we're so saturated, inundated, and sunk into our consciousness. So I think a really important strategy there is just to be patient with people and be ready to have long, difficult conversations with our friends and family members about these things, and even just random people sometimes. And again, to educate ourselves on these as much as possible, to be ready to tell people, like, okay, well, you're saying that, millions of Muslims are being killed in China, but look at where this information is coming from. It's coming from a far right Christian fundamentalist who believes that he's on a mission from God to westernize China. That's the main source of where this information is coming from. So again, it's like, like how to what to think, and helping people understand that, there is like an ideological like war going on. There's people that benefit from you believing these lies about China because it helps justify any U.S. aggression towards China, and understand that the role that misinformation plays. And again, to educate fundamentally to educate people and to educate ourselves and to be patient with people, I think are two fundamental things there.
And I love that you bring up that cui bono point, and I think like I'm going to tie back on that question later in my presentation. I also want to flag that we're going to have a presentation about propaganda and its role in promoting National Socialism in Germany and in America, and so kind of stay tuned throughout the day, because a lot of these questions sort of orbit one another. But Basil, I want to pivot really quickly, and I think this is probably our last question, related to what Cole just said. there was a lot of specifically racialized propaganda used to block left organizing in the South that you kind of talked about. And I'm curious too, is there an element of like Orientalism going on with some of this anti-existing socialist states propaganda?
Yeah, so no, the propaganda against China, DPRK, Vietnam, yeah, it's very much racialized. Like anti-communist propaganda historically has always been very racialized. The Communist Party at the time, since it was mostly black, in the South it was called the nigger party, basically. It was, and like anyone who was white in it, was, an outcast, or they were, they're very, talking about, earlier, their very whiteness was questioned. They're assumed to be either, Jewish or, something else. Because, how could like, white person be in the Communist Party? So yeah, it was like very much because communists historically have believed in things like integration, but even beyond that, full self-determination for Black people in the United States. Communism has always anti-communism has always been a very racialized thing, and like stereotypes about like different peoples has often played into anti-communist propaganda, like stereotypes about Asians has about the quote unquote Orient being like this very unsanitary place, played into like propaganda around coronavirus, like it can't all of this coronavirus, it all started with the wet markets. Or there's this propaganda of like a woman holding up a bat with chopsticks. I was like, this is where the coronavirus started. And, that woman was not even, I think she was Chinese, but she was not in China. She was in some Pacific island. I'm not sure which Pacific island it was, but it was very far from China. And she was I think she had like some food blog where she would, be like, oh, here's this like really cool food from this part of the world that you haven't heard of. And that was the context of it. But so it's like, it plays in this propaganda of like the darker, because like historically, communism has taken hold in the darker nations of Vietnam, China, DPRK, almost all like a lot of the African independence movements were led by communist parties, led by socialist parties. So like a lot in these people are often cast as dictators, like people like Kwame Nkrumah, Mugabe, like things like that. And so yeah, it's always been very much Orientalist, and it's always been tied to specifically United States has been tied to immigrants coming here and causing trouble, Jews coming here and causing trouble, and yeah, and a lot of times even a lot of times liberals will repeat this even in a lot of you see Wall Street Journal cartoons depicting Bernie Sanders is far from a communist, but even when he's depicted, sometimes it's in a very anti-Semitic way. Even with Ocasio-Cortez, there's a period where they're putting a lot of emphasis on her Jewish ancestry, and just very distasteful anti-Semitism, and now we're seeing also very distasteful anti-Asian Orientalism, and even a lot of discourse about Black people who are socialist, or even just part of the Black Lives Matter movement. Kamala Harris was talking about was talking about how Colin Kaepernick is a Russian asset, like we're Russian assets. Like us Black communists, we're Russian assets. We don't have any thoughts of our own. We have any we don't have any motivations of our own. We're assets of like the Russians or Chinese or whatever, and we don't have like any thoughts of our own as to why we're communists. We have to be paid off or something because we're not smart enough to make revolution on our own. That's basically been how anti-communist propaganda has been for years, because historically it's been led by Black and brown people, and it really like cuts into the ego of the kind of both white, liberal and conservative imaginary of that it has to be led by, good-hearted white people, or, Black people have to always be under the thumb of white supremacy.
Sorry, such good points, comrade. I really appreciate that. And so we've had a request for a reading list, and I think we're actually going to work on getting a reading list together from all the different presenters. So some of the texts that Basil and Cole mentioned that they also dropped in the chat, they'll drop in that reading list, so y'all can look forward to that. And then we've also got one more question from Haesung in the chat. But I'm going to ask maybe Basil and Cole if y'all can answer that in the chat so that we can hand it off for our next session. But really appreciate you, Basil, and really appreciate you, Cole, for allowing me to facilitate this session. This was really fun.
Yeah. Do you want to answer a question about like the sources here or in the in the chat?
You can go ahead and answer legit. I'm not gonna need my whole 45 minutes. Like
oh word. Okay, sweet.
okay. If you want just so the main source that I'm talking about, like with organizing in the South, like specifically Birmingham communists, is Hammer and Hoe by Robin D.J. Kelly. It's a really good source. On that, it's really well written. I actually like to do a study group on it at some point. So maybe stay tuned in for that. And also, if you just want to get learned generally about all stuff we were talking about generally, obviously. We're also talking about State and Revolution, is a book written by Vladimir Lenin. And yeah, it's also really relevant to this moment of really where, we're kind of inching closer and closer to revolution. So yeah, definitely check out State and Revolution. And if you want, if you want to get like more learn on on a lot of these themes, LiberationSchool.org is a good place to go to just it really breaks down a lot of the concepts, that are so crucial for communists to understand into a really easy to understand way. If you want to have a, good analysis of the current news, go on liberationnews.org, keep you current with the struggles going on. And also to dispel a lot of the myths that are being talked about by China, go to ChiaoCollective.com, which is QIAO collective.com. And it is just like a good resource on China by a lot of people in the Chinese diaspora and allies of the Chinese diaspora, just talking about China and dispelling a lot of the myths on China.
Childhood Corrective is a great source, as well as Gray Zone. They do a lot of work to dismantle imperialist propaganda in general, as well as Empire Files by Abby Martin is a great source on not necessarily what we've talked about today, but just in general on anti-imperialism. And the book that I mentioned again earlier about what to think versus how to think, that discusses that and a lot of other topics relating to the Vanguard Party and guerrilla warfare and things like that is Blood in My Eye by George Jackson. Can't recommend that book highly enough.
And we'll drop all those book titles and different recommendations in a document and send it out to anybody who was here today. But I wanted to double back real quick because I think there was a really good question from Hae Sung, and if we've got time, I'd love to have Basil and Cole talk about this a little bit, which is the question of like, and I'm going to actually make a split that doesn't exist in the question, but that I think is maybe helpful for us to talk about this, which is that does one, to counter the imperialist propaganda against China, or to acknowledge that propaganda against China is imperialist, does one have to accept China as a socialist state? In other words, like, can we have, to your mind, can we have two conversations going on separately? One, which is to acknowledge that some of the propaganda in the way that y'all mentioned is imperialist, and then another, which is to discuss and debate the merits of socialism with a Chinese character, or whether China or the DPRK or whatever are socialist, actually existing socialist states. Basil or Cole or both?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and I mean, to answer it simply, I think that you can, you can acknowledge that there are a lot of imperialist myths about China while sort of, debating like, is China truly socialist? That can be its own sort of debate. And I mean, I think, one thing that I want to make absolutely clear is we don't want to at all pretend like China is some kind of like perfect socialist utopia. It's not. China is rife with contradictions, and I view China as a socialist country for a number of reasons, but I can understand that there is room for debate there, because since the time of Mao, there has been a lot of capitalist reforms in China. But in my opinion, those are reforms. They're not a complete overhaul of the socialist system. And I think that particularly under President Xi, that China has done a lot to put itself back on the path towards socialism. And I think something very important to understand with scientific socialism is that socialism looks different in each country that it's being tried in. Building socialism is a process. It's an experiment that has to respond to the specific material conditions of the country that it's taking place in, and so that's going to look vastly different in each country. So in China, I think we do see socialism, but it's a socialism that is very different from, I mean, not fundamentally different, I don't think, but in a lot of ways, socialism with Chinese characteristics has a very different approach to the Bolshevik form of socialism, or the Cuban form of socialism, or the Venezuelan form of socialism. But I mean, I think like the ultimate thing for me there is that there's a billionaire class because of the capitalist reforms in China. There's a billionaire reactionary class in China. But I think an important thing to understand there is that class is that the Communist Party of China is still in power, and the Communist Party of China does a lot to rein in that reactionary class. I can't think of a single capitalist country where billionaires actually go to jail for economic crimes like they do in China, and where when Chinese companies take very like questionable actions in Africa, for instance, the CEOs of those companies are punished by the government and the Chinese Communist Party. So I mean, that there have been Chinese companies that have done sort of questionable things in Africa, to your point, Hae Sung. But I think it's a misinterpretation to say that that's an act of social imperialism by China, especially when the government itself is trying to rein in those questionable actions and isn't trying to I think it's important to understand that imperialism is part of its mission is to gain control and power over countries. And I think when you look at China's role in Africa, I don't see that as what's happening, especially when, for instance,
China has forgiven a lot of the loans to countries in Africa. It's just sort of like wiped those away with no real consequence to Africa for having not paid those.
Well, and really quickly, just because it was asked in the chat, I just wanted to explain. We got onto China we were talking about education initiatives in the Soviet Union under Lenin, and also in the Mid-South during the era of Black communist organizing in the 30s and 40s. And then we sort of had a few questions about, like, how can we educate today, and specifically how can we educate against some of the propaganda. And I think we found some connections between, the anti-Blackness that was used to suppress communism, anti-Asian third world rhetoric that's used to racialize communism and to sort of create these fear monger. So that's sort of how we pivoted from the Mid-South to China. But if I can just make one last plug, and then I do think we maybe should hop off here. One last plug would be the Party for Socialism and Liberation, Basil, Cole, my party. We host weekly study groups on Sundays, and we're finishing up reading State and Revolution right now, and we're about to pick our next text, and it probably will be something that was mentioned in the talk today. And there's also on Thursday nights, we host a loose education collaborative, which is just basically looking at some foundational revolutionary texts, nothing quite as big as a book, but more like articles, excerpts, things like that. So if you're interested in either of those things, when we send out our follow-up and when we send out the website, we'd love to hear from y'all and get y'all directed to the right resources for what you want. But I think the idea of ongoing study is I just really want to drive that home. And I think Cole and Basil made these points really, really well, that as revolutionaries, in order for us to be continually working on our practice and our theory, we have to be engaged in deconstructing the ways that we've been propagandized to, and then reconstructing an understanding that's grounded in the people and what the people need and what the people want and what the people experience. Basil, do you have any closing thoughts that you want to offer on Black communist organizing in the South?
Only closing thought I have is that, this stuff, we're still dealing with a lot of the same problems today. I think we actually have a lot of advantages. One thing is that I think, things are definitely much more integrated today, in that, socialism and communism won't make you as much of a social pariah today as it did then. Though things are becoming much and much more tense as we see the rise of right-wing violence. But I think it gives us a lot of reason to organize now. And yeah, we're dealing with a lot of the same issues, housing, unemployment, and violence, racial violence that's happening now. So we still have a reason to organize, and we gotta use all the tools that we have now to really organize ourselves.
Awesome. Thanks, Conrad. Cole, closing thoughts?
I actually just want to read this quote from Blood in My Eye by George Jackson, and just kind of, close with that. I think it sort of sums up, my overall sentiments about what we talked about. We can only be repressed if we stop thinking and stop fighting. People who refuse to stop fighting can never be repressed. They will either win or they die, which is more attractive than losing and dying. The primacy of politics remains, but we must now prepare for armed confrontation. By no stretch of the imagination can we hope to overthrow so determined an enemy without force. We will win.
Incredible. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, comrades. I appreciated the opportunity to be a part of this conversation, and excited to see what's coming down the pipeline for the rest of today.
Yeah, thanks, comrade.
Thank you.
Bye, y'all.